In today's discussion, we will go over many country situations and try to relate them to the crisis of 2007 in order to determine if these countries are heading into a new crisis or exiting one, or maybe avoiding one in the first place.
The financial crisis of 2008 started in the US because of some casualties. The entire investment banking industry, the biggest insurance company, the two enterprises characterized by the government to facilitate mortgage lending, the largest mortgage lender, the largest saving and loan, and two of the largest commercial banks. The carnage was not limited to the financial sector. However, as companies, the normal rely on credit suffered heavily. The American auto industry, which played for a federal bailout, found itself in the age of abyss.
Well, Brazil, the economic crisis started in Brazil in 2014 when with a political crisis led by Dilma Rousseff, which has now been impeached. It saw GDP reduction of 3.8%, which is a lot. And now it's starting to get over, but it's still shaky the economy, and there are still riots that prevent the country from getting into a good economy.
Argentinian crisis started with the dollar boom in 2017, and by the beginning of 2018, the situation just got worse. Some causes of the Argentinian crisis are the hyperinflation of the dollar compared with the peso, with the exchange rate of over 40 pesos compared with the dollar, and that's a 45% interest rate. And we can see this in the streets with people which do not have any place to sleep, or which don't have any food to eat, and neither water, and they don't have anything.
The US isn't in a crisis per se, but it has great potential as it has a huge trade deficit of 9.5%, and it depends a lot on foreign investment to make up for that deficit, so that it can make up for the expenses of the country. At any moment, if the foreign investments decided to take out their money from the country, they would fall into a crisis because of their huge difference in imports from exports.
The Turkish currency and debt crisis of 2018 is an ongoing financial and economic crisis. It is characterized by the Turkish lira plunging in value, high inflation, rising borrowing costs, and correspondingly rising loan defaults. The crisis was caused by the Turkish economy's excessive current account deficit and foreign currency debt, in combination with Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism and his unorthodox ideas about interest rate policy.
The last country to be discussed is Mexico, which, when compared to the rest of Latin America, is a relatively stable country. However, this doesn't mean that it's really stable. As we can see, the GDP per capita has decreased from 10,773 in 2013 to 9,325 in 2017. The total debt of the country, by the percentage of the GDP, has increased in 2013 from 40% to 48%, which is a huge amount, representing almost half of the total GDP of the country.
The truth problem in 2008 was that America was a drummer. By the end of the year, Germany, Japan, and China were locked in the recession, as many other smaller countries. China was entered to the recession and survived to it because they were not dependent on anyone's economy. But they do had a lot of exports to the US, Germany, and other places in Europe. As these places had a big recession and their economy could not afford them, China had a little back in their economy.
Well, the real problem in Brazil was in 2014 with Dilma Rousseff's election. With this election, many corruption scandals were discovered, which with a company called Petrobras, which is the oil company. It was a big setback, and investors started to getting out of the country, and this led to a 3.8 reduction in the GDP, as well as a 12% unemployment rate. The inflation rate started increasing to 4% approximately, which was high enough to make people unemployed. Right now, the economy has started getting better, but not good enough because the annual GDP growth rate is about 1%, which is nothing.
Just like in 2008, in Argentina, Argentinian crisis was caused by an bank delayed decision to provide solutions to the problem of hyperinflation, and like in Turkey, there are no resources and no money to pay those resources, so there is nothing the people can do, just wait for the IMF to help them and save the problem for them.
If the U.S. would go into a crisis, it would affect all these countries by an extent, as the dollar is a currency that affects everyone in different matters. This could happen simply if China would decide to take its money out of the U.S., as the U.S. would not be able to afford all of its expenses thanks to the trade deficits. The U.S. is the second leading exporter of goods and the first in the world first leading importer of the world, next to China, which means that the U.S.'s economy is in the verge of a crisis, which would affect every other country.
It says that the economy of my country, the lira fall on an operation against Turkey, rather than prevailing economic conditions, calling it deliberate attacks by the U.S. The country saw a 5.2% increase in GDP in the June quarter compared to 7.3% in the first quarter of the year. Under these conditions, Turkey must find 200 billion a year to fund its wide current account deficit and maturing debt, while being always at risk of inflows drying up. The state has gross foreign currency reserves of just 85 billion.
It is very hard to tell if Mexico is heading towards a crisis or avoiding one. This is because of the current political uncertainty since the recent elections. While in 2017 we saw a growth of 10% of the total value of Mexico's exports and an increase of 9% in direct foreign investment, the President-elect López Obrador, his politics are very much left-leaning and could scare off potential investors. That is why at the current moment we cannot tell if the peso will devaluate or appreciate. And in turn we cannot tell if Mexico's economy will improve or be affected by this in a negative way.
In the financial crisis of 2008, as in Brazil nowadays, there were thousands of unemployment people. The reason of this was that the enterprises were on big financial crisis and they could not afford having so many employees. People had a lot of debts, so they had to, the enterprises had to stop paying or unemploy these people, so they couldn't afford paying their bills to the bank. And these people stay with a lot of debt, and they could not pay what their loans to the banks. So the banks entered to a bankruptcy.
Well, actually, my economic crisis, which is Brazil, and Argentina's economic crisis are tightly related. I cannot longer export to Argentina because they can't afford my exports. So now I have to look to other clients and other countries to buy the things that Argentina bought earlier. And this will actually make Argentina's economy worse off than mine, but it affects my country as well.
Yes, and also in Brazil, Argentina's relations with Brazil are going worse because of the uncertainty of investors in on Brazilian companies on Argentina and vice versa, and also investors from the US are not very secure of investing in my country because the economic situation actually.
Also, my country is having elections like this October, so it creates political uncertainty, which isn't seen as good in the stability of the country, and investors are starting to get worried because they don't know what the outcome could be.
Another problem in the financial crisis of 2008 that is related with the crisis leaving now Brazil and is that investors were really scared when the banks start entering to bankruptcy. The two left investors were standing, Sketch and Morgan Stanley, and they thought they would be the next targets of the market. So they start looking for safer places than the US to invest their money. Then the US, if was already in red numbers, they get into worse numbers, and this started affecting all Europe that was held by the US, and well, China and Japan that export a lot to the US.
Speaking of the United States, Mexico's political situation is very tightly related to that of the United States because of their huge amount of trade that occurs between the two countries. This was very much sustained by NAFTA, which has recently undergone a renegotiation of the terms, which will negatively affect Mexico because the renegotiation of the terms are very negative towards Mexico. So it's very likely that this new renegotiation of the terms will lead Mexico to an even bigger crisis if a crisis is on the horizon.
We could see 2008's crisis happening again if the debt that the US owes gets greater and the US becomes unable to pay. As the public debt goes higher, means there's more taxes, which means there's less money to spend, so the GDP goes down. That means also investors from the US are less willing to invest in foreign countries because there's less money to spend. So in the end, the US is trying to turn around the trade deficits and all of the debts that it owes in order to not only prevent a possible crisis inside the US, but also prevent any other country from suffering a lot more, as they will suffer from the imports that go into the US because they wouldn't be able to pay it anymore.
Also, my country is affected by the US because it put on tariffs on things like steel that Brazil heavily relies on the US buying it. So now Brazil exporting to the US, it cannot go on any longer because the price affects the consumer.
On May in 2018, the Institute of Financial Research reported that the Turkish crisis has already spread to Lebanon, Colombia, and South Africa. None of the countries in here, but those three. The weakness of the Turkish currency is starting to affect other emerging markets' economies, such as the Indian rupee and the South African currency. And to conclude, as a country, we are looking at a scenario where the currency totally collapses. The inflation takes off, and Turks will be wandering around with wheelbarrows of lira trying to buy a loaf of bread. The dollar is basically kneecapping countries before warning that others could be affected if they continue to pursue their policies that Erdogan is seeking to pursue.
As a final note, I think we can all agree that the current political situation leads to a huge uncertainty, since every single one of our countries could be heading towards a crisis or avoiding one.